So 1, 2, 1, 2. I ended up where I couldn't play a fill at the end, so.
It's a nice surprise ending, no?
Yeah.
Hey everyone, we're here in Montreal. Actually, not Montreal, the west side of Montreal, close to the airport.
West Island, baby.
West Island, there we go.
Yeah, man.
Town, Dorval. This is Dorval.
Dorval, yeah.
And I'm here with, I guess one could say, one of the legends of jazz guitar in Montreal. Highly active for a very long time, but now happily retired. Greg Clayton. So, actually, I wanted to talk to you because you're part of. I'm very interested in history, music history, jazz history, how people learn, and I guess you're part of this era that's very fascinating. So you say, if I can reveal your age, you said you were 70 years old. That means
I'm 72.
72.
Yeah, man.
So basically, you're born in an era where maybe by the time you're in your late teens and 20s, like the jazz education started to become standardized and things like that. So
I started to, but when I started, actually later than that. I mean, for me, anyways. You know,
well, that's
like living in Montreal,
you're in Canada. It's true that Canada came later. So can you tell us about how you started when you were younger with music and jazz and all that stuff?
Well, as a kid, of course, I heard music. I always liked music. I remember in the 50s, growing up as a kid, you'd hear like Nat King, you'd hear Elvis, but you'd also hear Sinatra with Nelson Riddle, Nat King Cole. So I always liked standard tunes. So, and then in my teens, the blues was really popular, the British invasion and bringing blues back to the, to the white audiences in North America, right? That didn't know about South Side of Chicago and stuff like that, I guess, to some degree. Anyway, so that sort of brought the blues, there was sort of a blues boom, so I got interested in that, and I used to go to the Esquire show bar and hear like, the different blues artists, and through that heard some jazz artists as well, and on record and whatever. And so I remember I was on a lunch break and I went to a record store, the old place called the Record Cave, Dave Silver's Record Cave. And he used to see me come in there and, I'd buy like an obscure Freddie King record or something, right? And one day he says to me, "You like the blues?" He says, do you like jazz? And he showed me a couple of records. And so I bought a Charlie Parker album and I bought a Wes album. And I went home and I listened to it and I recognized not only the bluesy type stuff, the jazz originals and whatever, the standards. I recognized a couple of these tunes. I remember there was "This Time the Dream's on Me," Bird played, and I can't remember what ones Wes played, like maybe Polka Dots or something like that. So I knew this sound from being a kid in the 50s. So I liked it. So that's how I got into it, basically.
How old were you then?
I was probably 20, 19, something like that. I started young in music, like at 12. We played in bands. I tried guitar, I tried trumpet, I tried drums a little bit. I sang, even before my voice changed. Yeah, whatever was popular at the time. Yeah. The kid stuff, but then sort of drifted away from it, but came back to it through, hearing, like I liked Freddie King a lot, Albert King, Muddy Waters, the real Chicago blues. So I related to that. And through that got into jazz, and as I say, then it just sort of went from there,
So basically in those days, for those who don't know, Montreal was a big international city for jazz. It's no longer, we'll talk about that later, but so two questions in one. Then how did you go about learning this music, and how was it learning it in Montreal?
Okay, well, at the beginning it was, pretty, it was sort of like a desert, because I grew up in Lachine, which is a suburb of the city, so I didn't really have contacts in the city. There were musicians around, and there were some who knew who Wes was, and I used to go to Rockheads. I used to go down to Rockheads and hear Nelson and Ivan, and of course eventually got to know them, Nelson Simons and Ivan Simons, and some of the other people around that orbit. Old Nick, who used to play piano at the Cotton Club in New York back when Ellington was there. In fact, he's in that movie with Lena Horne. Nick Aldrich was his name. He was a pianist, but he played electric bass at this time when I know him. And he was like the age I am now. And so yeah, he was around. And so, but the jazz education wasn't really, it was probably happening in the States, but it wasn't really happening here. You had to learn from other musicians or from recordings. And I can remember like learning stuff, and I didn't know what I thought this chord was called E extended, and I remember hearing Wes and realizing he was playing on this shape, this sound, but I didn't know that was G minor 9 or whatever. It was just, I didn't even know that was a major 7. I just knew, I knew it had a major component to it, right? So we didn't know that much, we just learned songs, and you sort of like, went by ear and got what you could off of records. There was no slow down stuff, so you'd put the record player on 16 to get a difficult passage, but then it would be like, so you sort of approximated what you heard, what you could get naturally. You know what I mean? And then eventually, I took a couple of lessons at a local music store with a beautiful classical guitarist named Bruce Adams, and so he turned me on to being literate musically, but I didn't study classical. I just did a little bit with him, but he opened the door to reading and what was available and all that. And so then I went to Berkeley for a summer semester.
I see.
And that was I was just talking with the guys yesterday, actually. We had a little session here, And you know, what really did it for me there, because the first semester, I went for this summer semester because it was affordable. It was
Can I just ask which year was this around, roughly?
early 70s.
Okay.
And so I went there, and I took the performance stream program, and I wanted to learn as much as I could theory-wise and stuff, and I found out you didn't get that in performance, right? So I didn't pick up that much, but what I did pick up from all the musicians there, I got a real quick crash course in all the records I didn't know about and different artists, and you know, and then they were living in downtown Boston. It was the Jazz Workshop in Paul's Mall, so you go and see these groups. They'd let the students in late at night, not on the weekends, but on a weeknight. For the last set, you could get in sometimes without paying a cover, and you know, so I heard a lot of stuff there. And yeah, just it was an immersion in, you know, being with a whole bunch of people who were into what I was trying to be into. So that's how I sort of got. Then I went back the following summer and took arranging composition. So I learned a little bit more, you know, like basic arranging stuff and courses like voicings derived from chord scales. And so it was good for the knowledge, you know, it's sort of some stuff which I was able to apply to guitar. And I palled up with a really killer guitar player who's still very active in New Orleans named Steve Mazakowski. He's a monster. He was a monster then. And so we were sort of kindred spirits. We liked the same stuff. And he was very inspiring. His work ethic was like ridiculous. You know, I remember one night I said to him the next day, yeah, I was watching TV, because I eventually moved out of the dorm, was living with some bunch of young people, you know, in a suburb of Boston, sort of like NDG. And I mentioned watching some TV. He goes, watching TV? It's like, what's wrong with you, man? You know. So, anyways, people like that were influential and inspirational. But I didn't have good family support to actually do the whole program or to stay there. And in those days, you couldn't get government grants and assistance for undergrad studies out of country. It had to be graduate. But there was nowhere in Canada to get an underground jazz thing.
That was in the 80s, right? McGill.
No, early 70s. Yeah, that came later in the 80s. Yeah, right. That came in the 80s with Kevin Dean came.
Too early.
Yeah. So anyways, so basically, I learned what I learned. I stayed in Boston for better part of a year after that summer semester, hanging out with musicians, playing and, you know, listening and all that. And then came back here and, you know, gradually started to meet some players my age in Montreal and, you know, started doing a few gigs. And
so basically it was the whole community thing, like that you learned like through the environment kind of.
Yeah, more or less, yeah. But it's hard to imagine today in the information age. People didn't know as much technically and theoretically, you know what I mean? So, you know, like a guy like Boogie Godet would show you a saxophone player, and he played keyboards and he played valve trombone, you know, super old school, like natural musician, right? And he would show you a tune. He couldn't tell you the chords on the saxophone, but he'd sort of play the voice leading a little bit.
So that's how you learned tunes in those days?
Sometimes, yeah. Like there'd be a request that I didn't know, and so on the break he'd say, well, it goes like this. You know? So we'd sort of work it out. So anyways, you know, that was the difference. But then, of course, everything exploded, you know, and the Abersold came out, and the early Abersold records. And prior to that, there was a thing called Music Minus One. I don't know if you ever
heard of that.
those.
Yeah.
Those were actually pretty good, because, again, cats like Wilbur Ware and Kenny Clark on drums and stuff, they didn't have the long sections for you to blow on. They'd have like one or two choruses, and it'd be sort of more of like a little arrangement or something. But the feel was there, you know? But anyway, so yeah, that's basically how we learned, you know, sort of little bit at a time. Or you learn through learning a tune, as you well know. You learn one tune, you sort of know a bunch of other tunes eventually.
That's
right?
Cool.
So, okay, what's different?
But it seems like it was much a harder way to learn, but it must have done something like really, I guess, like assimilate the music in your body without really understanding what's going on. Was that kind of the case?
Yeah, there's some of that, I would say, yeah. There's some of that. But I mean, you know, most keyboard players knew what they were doing, and, you know, again, I was just talking about my personal experience.
Yeah.
You know, I didn't really know much. I didn't know theory, and, you know, then I got this little book called The Basis of Music. It's like sort of a classical primer, sort of. And, you know, and I learned, you know, intervals and versions of intervals, you know, all that stuff, learned that. So when I did go to that Berkeley course in the summer, you know, I was able to hang in there, and I realized actually, you know, I should have taken a little bit more intensive course, which I did later. But and when I stayed there, actually, when I wasn't in school, I still, because I was known around the building, they knew I audited some stuff.
Oh, cool.
You know, so yeah. But the main thing is just doing it through playing, I think, you know.
So then, okay, you were, I guess, what, 23, 24, 25?
Yeah.
By the time you came back to Montreal, you
Yeah,
started
yeah.
playing a lot.
24, something like that.
How
yeah.
was the scene then?
Well, it actually, I mean, the golden age was over. I mean, we heard about it from the older generation, like Andre's father and Art Roberts, and, you know, all different cats, right? Boogie and, you know, the older generation. But we really missed that whole thing of when there were like 500 union nightclub gigs in Montreal. That all ended in, I think, around 67, because Drapeau cleaned up the city for Expo 67, and he basically wanted to drive all the gangsters out. And of course, a lot of the clubs, right, are places where, you know, strange money gets laundered.
So you didn't get to go there as an early teen or like...
No.
So, okay, so
No.
way after that.
Yeah, way after that, yeah.
But then still, compared to today, how was it? Because today it's still, I think, I you know, been here doing music for more than Montreal for quite a long time. But
Yeah.
I think I caught kind of the tail end of when, for example, I've seen you play at Modavi before. Those things like that don't really exist as much anymore, so...
No.
From like,
It
let's
was
say,
even fairly rare then. Like, I was lucky I had 2 gigs. I had a Sunday, Monday, Tuesday for 18 years, and then at the same time I had a Thursday, Friday, Saturday for almost 20 years, right? Like 19 or something. So there was a period there where I was working 6 nights a week, you know, every week.
And would you say that's also part of how you kind of learned? Like,
Well, it gave me a chance to play a lot of tunes, you know, because you can't keep playing the same repertoire over and over again. Once the kitchen staff knows your next tune after you play one, then they know what the next one is. Your days are numbered. You know, you got to keep changing up, you know. And so, and we had singers. Sometimes we had singers. Sometimes it was duo or trio, you know, instrumental, or you know, like I was working with Boogie for a while, and Richard Paris, another beautiful saxophone player, old school saxophone player. Now Richard was a guy from that era, and Richard would say, like, he couldn't really name chord. He knew basics. He knew like 5/1, but he didn't know all the details, you know. And he used to say, well, each chord player puts their own little things on it. He says, but if I know the melody, that tune is dead. He used to say. And the thing is, I saw him do it, and it was interesting. He played more in a chord changes type of way, you know, like for one of a better, let's say sort of like a Sonny Stitt type of player. And Boogie, he was more of like Zoot Sims, Charlie Ventura, you know. So he was a little more in that sort of mainstream style. And again, like, both those guys knew every tune because they came up in that, you know, that era. They knew every single tune, you know. And so I learned playing with both of them and accompanying both of them. Even though I was the leader of the gig, I hired them, and it was sort of graduate school in a way.
like mentorship.
Because I would have to comp differently or play slightly different chords and stuff even on the same tune between Boogie and Richard, because they had different requirements rhythmically and harmonically. You know, they had different styles.
And they would tell you things like, hey...
They would tell you nothing.
Oh. So
nothing. But I could tell. I wanted to understand. You know, I wanted to do this. So you know, I wanted to sort of, you know, get better and make a contribution, and accompany them properly. You know. So yeah. So so that was influential for me. You know.
Wow.
I mean, it was very helpful. And working with singers was nice. And they have different strengths. Like, I used to work with John LaBelle, and John knew how to work with a group, and he knew how to swing, which some singers have beautiful voices and they don't listen to the band really. But John never practiced chops or anything. You know, he was not Pavarotti, but the guy could swing. He was in there with us rhythmically. You know, he was always in there with us. So, you know, I really liked him. And then others, like, there was Sharda Bandman, I mean, I'm not going to name everybody because I'll leave people out. A lot of people play with, and nice singers and that, and players. But she's an example of somebody who had the vocal thing quite together, and then I think she decided I'm going to work on my time, and all of a sudden she was like kicking butt, man. You know, so that was interesting.
That's amazing.
So yeah, like, when you're a young player, I was no different. And also I should mention also, when I came back to Montreal and that, I started playing with like Charles Ellison and Pete Magadini and Dave Turner, and all of these guys gave me the opportunity. So I got a chance to play with these cats, So this was also very influential. Thank you, you guys. I've never thanked you, but actually,
These are all local Montreal.
Yeah,
legends.
monsters. Yeah, local monsters. And, great artists and great people, too. Really great people. And, so, I've reached an age, I guess, where I reflect a little bit. And I've thought of that. I thought, man, because I was just out there, like, doing it. It's like, okay, I'm going to play, no clue about some things and, able to do other things or whatever. But playing with these guys was really helped.
That was a big community spirit then.
You have to play. I mentioned to you that, I had some health issues, and I think it was because I got sort of burned out teaching several days a week, plus playing 6 nights a week, never taking vacations, and I had a family, I had elderly parents that were ill. So I was really like, up against it, as they say. But I wanted to play, because to me that's what is gonna, if you want to realize what you can do and learn and and grow and all that, you got to play all the time.
Well, let's talk a little bit then now about kind of this education, because you're also, for those of you who don't know, McGill University is in Montreal. It's one of the biggest, it's the first jazz program in Canada, I think, is it?
I think it's the first that offered like a full major, and I think so, yeah.
So you've been teaching there since when, until when about?
I started, I think, in around 89. Well, here's the thing. So they brought in some people. I think they had a jazz program. There was a great pianist named Armis Meisty who was teaching a jazz course at McGill, but I think you were still basically in the classical program. And guys like Steve Holt and Jeff Lapp and others came through that, right? But then after, I guess the school decided they were actually going to have a jazz program. And because there were no universities in Canada that offered masters or even bachelors and stuff in jazz, they had to go to the States to get people. So they got Kevin Dean, a beautiful trumpet player from the United States, from Iowa. And they brought him up, and a Canadian guy that had studied at North Texas, Gordon Foote, and they had other people right now that names escape me, but there were a few people they started the program. So here's the thing. So another guy that I collaborated a lot with when I was starting out was Fred Henke. When I say starting out, I mean starting out in jazz, playing a lot downtown and stuff, right? Was Fred Henke. And so Fred called me one time. He says, man, playing at Biddle's this week with a new trumpet players come from the States. Kevin Dean should come down and check them out. So of course I went down and heard Kevin. And we hit it off right away, similar interests, blah, 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 blah. And so the reason I mention this is he came here, and unlike a lot of, sort of school cultures or just community cultures, when he started the program, he didn't just hire a bunch of people from around that were in the schools or whatever. He went out in the community and found out who was playing. And he hired some people, regardless of whether you had the academic qualifications or whatever. But if he thought you could play, right? So he started bringing the local players in, which of course happens everywhere. But he did this, and he didn't have to do it, right? So that was nice. So that's how I got in there. He started out, giving me a few things. You want to be on an exam panel, you want to be on a audition panel, things like that. And then eventually people requested lessons, and you get your foot in the door. And then I started teaching a few courses and things like that. So does that answer your question?
Yeah. How long did you do that for? When did you kind of?
Well, I think I started probably 89 doing the little bits and pieces. So probably 90, 91 or something that I actually started teaching there. And I stopped in 2016.
That's quite.
Yeah,
Quite a
2016.
number of years.
Yeah. And although up until and including the COVID period, I still did some private lessons
You were there.
online through Zoom.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Cool.
So, but probably won't be doing that anymore, you know. But yeah.
That's one thing. The next question is, I've worked with a lot of players from an older generation as well, and I think the mentality is a little bit different. People who didn't go to school, people who did go to school. It seems like nowadays when you go to a jazz program, they have the impression that you have to be able to play all sorts of different styles of jazz, all sorts of things. But I remember working with older generation, and I would tell them, do you play this? I don't like that. You know, like.
Yeah.
So how is this for you? You were involved in school, but also you're also from that older generation.
Yeah.
How do
well,
you?
I mean, you know, like I like a lot of stuff, including non-jazz. You know, I mean, if I like it, I like it. You know, but I'm pro the idea of exposing the students or young musicians exposing themselves to a wide variety of stuff, and then eventually, you will choose to narrow the path a little bit, perhaps. You know, unless you're like Keith Jarrett or something who can do anything. But you know, you'll sort of narrow the path and you'll decide, or the business will decide for you. You might think, yeah, man, you know, I'm the greatest like free player on the planet. But if everybody's calling you to accompany singers, the community is telling you something. This is what we like that you do. So maybe you ought to work on that, you know, or maybe you ought to accept that, and you know, doesn't mean you can't do the other thing, but you know, so there's that. I used to tell the students that, you know, I say keep in mind what your peers and what the community is telling you, because you're getting information there if you think about it. And I say this, I was clueless, you know.
But then it kind of leads me to another question. Is, of course, nowadays it's very hard to define jazz. It can mean a lot of different things for different people.
Yeah.
And actually, I had a friend of mine we grew up together, and he was studying with you at McGill. His name is Marco Hennes. He doesn't play no, he has arthritis. But anyway, you said to him something very interesting that at that time we were too young to really understand. You were talking. There was some kind of a video of John McLaughlin playing Cherokee with a big band.
Oh yeah, that was on the Tonight Show. Yeah,
and you were saying, yeah, but that's not bebop. At that time, we didn't understand what that meant, but now when we watch, oh yeah, that isn't bebop.
No, it's not. But at the same time, I mean, John McLaughlin is still a beast.
Yeah,
right? He's
yeah.
an incredible musician.
The point is, like, we didn't understand the stylistic thing.
Yeah,
so what are your thoughts on, like...
Right. Because I remember one student said to me, who's a really good player, too, these days. And although I haven't seen him in a number of years, but I remember him saying to me, yeah, I want to study jazz, but I want to play bebop with distortion. He said this to me, you know. So what do you say to that? That's just a young person talking, you know. It's a sort, you know what I mean. I want to play bebop with distortion. What does that mean? You know. So, but you know, I mean, yeah, we're all sort of young and clueless at some point, right? So, yeah, it's just part of the gig, I guess, you know. But the thing of I don't like and I don't know. I find most people are open and, you know, but you have your personal preferences also based on what you liked as a kid, what you've been exposed to, you know, your personality and, you know. So Bob Mover said an interesting thing. He said, I forget who told him this, but one of the, like, you know, the cats, like, you know, from the old days, said to him, some people pick up an instrument or go into music because they want to pick up an instrument, play an instrument. And some people go into music because they want to play songs. So that was an interesting, I think it was Lee Konitz that told him this. I could be wrong. But someone of that stature, right? And I think that makes sense, you know, because I can relate to that. I always wanted to play songs. I didn't want to practice technique and do abstract things. I just wanted to learn songs and play songs and, you know.
Because now I hear you're playing, it's a very, of course, reminds me of a certain era, you know, old school jazz guitar playing. But I know that in 2000, in about late 90s, early 2000s, when I was younger, what was really in fashion was not so much that style, but more like Pat Metheny, kind of a more modern thing. So how do you reconcile teaching and that stuff in that era?
Well, but the thing is, like, they come in... Students, you're talking like private lessons now, for example.
Private lessons, or just people come to you just asking?
Yeah, well, then, you know, they'll ask you this stuff, and so they'll come with a question. Often it's like, well, what's he doing here? So you'll listen to the thing, you'll figure it out, and you'll try and explain it to him. You know, a good example is Pat Metheny. he was playing a tritone substitution, you know. This guy was enamored of this line and didn't understand it, and I guess couldn't relate to Bud Powell doing it. But he was younger, and he was really into Metheny and that group at the time, and this, I guess, the late '80s maybe. And yeah, he brought me the solo, and I figured out a few of the things and explained them and said, actually, these are the things I've been talking to you about. It's just he's playing it in a slightly different rhythmic context, and the chord changes are a little different, a few more slash chords, and, you know, stuff like that. Interesting story about Pat Metheny, who obviously is a great artist, right? Amazing composer, and, you know, whatever. So I talked about Steve Mazikowski from New Orleans. So we heard about Pat Metheny. I think he had just moved to Boston to playing with Gary Burton, and he'd got him a gig at Berkeley. So Steve and I had heard about him. We're big time into like early Joe Pass, you know, the Pacific jazz stuff, and Wes, and, you know, Rainey, Tal Farrell, you know, that type of stuff, and Grant Green. And so we say, let's go and check him out. He's playing up in Cambridge. So we walked from downtown Boston to Cambridge, which, you know, is a fairly good walk. We walked up there, we go into this club, had no cover, just buy a beer, and the band was Bob Moses, Jacko, and I guess they were preparing for that first record, right? And yeah, playing some of Pat's tunes, you could tell there was something different happening. It was fresh, you know? And yet it was harmonically complex, and, you know, and I don't remember Jacko being the Jacko we later heard, you know, this amazing virtuoso. I just remember him playing, I don't know if it was fretless at the time, but he was playing electric bass, which surprised us a little bit and whatever. But yeah, so I don't know, that just came to mind.
So you're just witnessing kind of a big change that was to happen.
I suppose, yeah. Yeah.
So you had access to this big community environment, and the landscape nowadays is very, very different for people who are your age back in those days. Well, of course, we have technology nowadays, but I guess opportunities are no longer the same. Do you have anything to say about that?
Yeah, they're not, you know, there were always a few little jazz clubs that actually paid money, you know, and you could work there with one group and work there with your own group once in a while and with other groups, you know. Like I remember playing the same places as a member of Pete Magadini's group, Charles Ellison's group, my own group, and this would happen at Biddles as well. Later Biddles, Jeff Lapp and Johnny Scott got the gig full time, but that gig used to change every 2 weeks. So you'd get 2 weeks from 6 to 10, and then a radio show on the second Wednesday of the 2 weeks or something like that. And you could do that a couple times a year. So there was a big community. It wasn't that big. There are a lot more now because of the schools, and it's just coming out of the woodwork now. But there's less places to play. But at the same time, you know, there's a lot of great things about today too. You know, like I can remember telling somebody, I remember when I first got a copy of Larry Young Unity, the album, which, you know, we'd sort of been looking for, myself and other friends, you know, been looking for this record. There were no reissues yet. Except there were a few in Japan, but they didn't leak over here that much. And somebody got a cassette copy, and it must have been like an 18th generation because it sounded like it was recorded underwater, you know, muffled. And but we were happy to have it, you know. So nowadays you can go on YouTube and hear anything immediately for free, right?
Yeah.
So, and you can slow it down and the pitch stays the same, you know. So yeah, so sometimes I'll go on YouTube and listen to a tune and it's like, what are they doing there? You know, like if it's a tune I don't know, I'll want to hear it. Or if it's one I do know, and you notice something different they do, right? I'm sure you do that too.
Yeah, for sure.
So yeah, I mean, this is a great benefit. This is a great boon, you know.
Sure.
So there's that. I mean, I think music will always keep going, you know. And you also asked me, and I think I took it off track. You asked me like, what was jazz, or
Yeah, like
how would you define it?
stylistic, yeah, because nowadays there's so much.
Right. So my answer to that would be, some people think jazz equals only improvisation. I don't agree with that because Willie Nelson improvises, right?
Greatest bebop player ever.
Yeah, but he's not a jazz player. Although he did an album of standards, he's not a jazz player. rock players, some of these amazing rock artists, right? They improvise all day and all night, but they don't play jazz. It has to come from, I think, there has to be some relation, to it's African American music, and it comes from the Buddy Bolden and Louis Armstrong and Earl Hines and Duke Ellington and onward, right? It has to be related to that to some degree. It doesn't mean you have to be African American to do it, but that's the aesthetic.
Well,
that's the aesthetic. That's you know what I mean? That's the culture, right? Now of course it's very international and all that, but the world is, I mean, we're all human beings. To me, there's only one race, the human race. Everybody else we're just different phenotypes.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like in a garden, you'll have a bunch of plants, and there'll be different phenotypes, even though they all come from, they're all the same, they're all roses, but they'll be slightly different humans are different phenotypes to me.
Actually, that raises a very interesting question when you're talking about that. Nowadays, of course, when you go to music school, there's pretty much a list of tunes that quote unquote you gotta know. And often because of the Real Book and now the iReal Pro, the chord changes are pretty much set in stone in some ways. Whereas back in the day when you listened to recordings, there were tons of different ways to play the same song.
Yeah.
And not only that, people like Parker, Coltrane, whatever, and Bill Evans, they came from that, you were talking about Louis Armstrong swing era, where they were, maybe didn't play them, but they were aware of a lot of the standards that were kind of no longer played today, except for now in this kind of revival in New York, Paris, New Orleans of the trad jazz scene. But nowadays it's separate. People are part of the trad jazz scene or they're part of quote unquote anything after. So like, what are your thoughts on stuff like that?
I think there was an element of that in the past too. You had mainstream, you had the end of the sort of, for want of a better word, Dixieland type of players. You had the mainstream, and you had the early modern, and you had the hardcore bop people, the hard bop, the avant-garde guys in the 60s, and a lot of players had, feet in several camps or whatever. So I think that's seems to be, fairly consistent.
Okay.
Although at one time, of course, there was sort of a common practice, like, the bebop era. But again, think about it. During the bebop era, Louis Armstrong was still only like in his late 30s or something. Like, he wasn't an old cat, man. And here's another thing. Remember this guy, Scott Hamilton?
Mm-hmm.
When he came out, he was seen as like a throwback, and, he was into like Ben Webster and Coleman Hawkins and all that. But even he, when you listen to him, he doesn't play their exact vocabulary. Yeah, it's very informed and inspired by that, but he's also got things in his playing that come from later. You can't not have that. Well, right? Yeah. So some of it leaks in.
But I know, like, for example, Louis Armstrong himself didn't really change his style so much, but I know that when he was recording in the 50s, working with younger cats, they didn't play rhythm the same way they played in the 30s.
Right.
So that was very interesting, too.
That's right, yeah, that's right. Or like the Billie Holiday records. Listen to Billie Holiday from the early days, where she basically, if you don't listen to the words, you listen to the phrasing and the tone even to a point, it's pops. It sounds like Louis Armstrong to me, right? Then you go, but there's a certain period of accompaniment that's reminiscent as well. And then you hear her stuff in the 50s, in the era where her voice was supposedly gone and all that, right? And yeah, she wasn't so young anymore. But listen to the rhythm section she was playing with. They were not the other style, the earlier style, and that stuff's great too.
Yeah.
So I guess there's always going to be a little bit of what Nelson Simons used to call intermingling.
But then, in terms of like standard or people that you would tunes that you would play back in those days when you were in your formative in your 20s, and also which tunes did you choose? How was it chosen? Nowadays, it's kind of like every school you got to know these standards,
Yeah.
And also the next question is, how did you decide on the changes?
I think it was through common practice, if you research, if you check out of several versions of a tune, you're probably going to hear, especially if it's a standard, you're probably going to hear some different bass lines or ergo chord changes, right? Based on the favorite things of whoever the leader is, or the pianist or something. They sort of have their little things they favor, right? Their little harmonic devices. So there's that. But what we did, basically, like, you know, if you played, whoever was the leader, if they wanted such and such a chord change, that's what you played. You know, they'd mention it. Or not. You know, and there was sort of common practice versions, I suppose, but yeah, and you know, you hear these things like, you know, there's the West Coast, we used to hear this, there's the West Coast chord changes, and the, you know, so, yeah.
It's interesting because, you know, I told you, I live in Japan now, they have their own real book written by Japanese guys, so and some that say, oh, that's how they play this song, they play this song this way, this, it was very interesting.
Yeah, they're serious over there.
Yeah,
right. You were telling me, right, that there's a huge jazz scene there. And there, I mean, going back to the '60s and early '70s, there were quite a few guys from Japan living in New York were on the scene with the younger generation at that time. You know, Hino and Masabumi Kikuchi, and yeah, there were guys. There's another bass player, I forget his name now, but you know, they were in there. You know what I mean? So and then, as you know, of course, they had the reissue program. They sort of saved the world in a way in one period, right? They were reissuing all the jazz, and eventually you could get it. We used to go to New York just to get records. You know?
Wow.
Yeah, because here you couldn't get them. You know?
Why don't you just go on YouTube? Save some money. But well. Yeah, man. Greg, thank you so much for this, man. It was a great pleasure.
Pleasure to finally hang out in person. Yeah,
another tune or something?
Yeah, okay, we could, yeah.